Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the New Humanitarian's annual 10 Crises to Watch event. My name is Heba Aly. I'm the director of the New Humanitarian and pleased to be moderating today's conversation. Our 10 Crises to Watch list tries to give people a kind of one-stop shop for global trends that will affect humanitarian needs in the year ahead and help particularly global busy policymakers focus their efforts. The New Humanitarian, as many of you know, reports from crisis zones around the world, and that gives us a unique vantage point in connecting the dots on some of these bigger trends that we're seeing. So today we're going to try to give you that bird's eye view outlook for 2021, which is pretty easy to be pessimistic about in the shadow of COVID, with all of its knock-on effects and in a year that is likely to have rising needs and less money to respond. And so within all of those needs, all of those priorities, where do you focus your attention? What's likely to change in the year ahead? And that's what we're going to try to help you navigate in the next hour and a half. We normally present our 10 crises to watch lists at the World Economic Forum in Davos, but this year we wanted to do something more accessible and with a broader cross-section of insights around the world. So I'm going to encourage our speakers to turn on their cameras, and I will introduce you to them. We have Julia Sanchez, Secretary General of ActionAid International, a native of Peru, but based in Canada. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
Comfort Eru is Interim Vice President and Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group, normally based in Nairobi, but joining us today from London. Hi, Comfort.
Thank you very much.
Sudhanshu Singh is founder of Humanitarian Aid International, dialing in from India. Welcome, Sudhanshu.
Hello, everyone.
Dr. Sherine Taraboulsi-McCarthy is a Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London. Hi, Sherine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
And finally, Eilidh Kennedy is co-director at the Humanitarian Foresight Group, IARAN, the Interagency Research and Analysis Network, also in London. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Online, we have an active chat already going with people tuning in from China, from Nigeria, from Myanmar, from Norway, from Canada, from Romania, from Switzerland, from Los Angeles. The list goes on, so it's really great to see such a global reach, and I will be encouraging all of you online to also be part of this conversation. You can tweet during and after the event using the hashtag Crises to Watch, and you can tag us at New Humanitarian. For those watching on Zoom, you can use the chat function to introduce yourselves, as you've already been doing, and to exchange ideas and react to the speaker's comments, and use the Q&A function to put in questions and upvote other people's questions. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also comment and ask questions there. We're monitoring that as well. I'll be trying to weave questions into the conversation, including those we've received in advance, but we will also try to make room for them at the end. But for those of you who are regulars at the New Humanitarians events, you know that we always try to pack in too much into the conversation. So let's see how far we can get. And yes, for the question, we always get the recording will be available afterwards. If you have registered for the event, you'll get an email with the recording. Otherwise, you'll find it on our website in a few days' time. So I want to kick things off by asking each of our guests to just give us a window into how you're feeling heading into 2021. What's keeping you up at night the most, if you had to pick one thing, and what's one positive development that gives you a bit of hope? And for those of you in the audience, please also share your chats. We do actually go through them all after these events and try to learn from those insights as well. Julia, sorry, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm a great sleeper. I never have trouble going to sleep, but I wake up early.
Oh, I'm very jealous of both friends.
But I wake up early and I want to wake up when my alarm rings, and I never manage to these days. So this morning I woke up before my alarm rang and I'm like, okay, what am I thinking about? What wakes me up so early? I think for me, one of the things that I mull over a lot these days is how do we leverage what the COVID crisis has shown us, both the negative and the positive, the potential and the enormous challenges that we face, to fight the big fight that we have to fight, which is on climate change, our big existential crisis. I often hear people talking about that, that we have to choose one or the other, that maybe we're responding to to COVID at the stake of, neglecting climate change. But there's so many similarities. I mean, just the fact that these are clearly global, problems that require global solutions, how they don't respect boundaries. But yet we've seen that, with all their failings, governments have actually stepped up in a way that they haven't on climate change yet. It was really an alarm bell that went off and people stepped. So how do we use that capacity to mobilize governments, people, the capacity to all of a sudden throw all this austerity talk out the window and have governments step in? How do we as civil society, as humanitarian actors, use those openings and those precedents, if you will, of global solidarity, mobilizing to tackle the root causes of the bigger challenges that we have long term? So that's something I'm often mulling about. I wonder sometimes if we're losing the window of opportunity. At first it seems so clear. It's like, okay, COVID is showing us what the real problems are: the inequality, the injustice, the disparity. That's the problem. And it's the same, of course, problem as underlying climate. How do we use that to really make a difference in a sustainable long-term way? So that keeps me up at night. The hope, or early in the mornings, the hopeful part for me going into this year was to see that despite countries and governments looking inwards because of COVID, to our great surprise, people haven't done that. Individuals haven't done that. We were pleasantly surprised with the sustained levels of solidarity within our networks, in the ActionAid networks of supporters throughout the crisis. So I think a lot of people were hit, or at least expected to be hit by COVID, but also had a strong sense that there were others, as usual, that are worse hit, that will have to bear the real burden of this crisis like other crises. And so the generosity, the solidarity, the resources that flowed were not impacted a lot. So that gives me hope that the human connection and solidarity is still strong and hasn't been impacted in the way it could have been, and not in the way that governments have kind of started looking inwards as well.
Comfort, how about you?
Thank you very much, Heba, and I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. I'll pick up on what Julia just said. I think COVID-19, looking at it from a Africa continental perspective, the fallout from the pandemic, I think the real impact will be felt this year. Last year, the narrative on the continent, and for those who are observing or looking at what was going on the continent, was that the continent may have just escaped, the sort of the death rates that we saw in the West, in Europe, in the US, that the continent appeared more resilient because it had managed and had experiences like the Ebola experience and knew how to cope with these kind of sort of pandemics because it dealt with malaria and cholera. But in fact, I think the reality is very different. Last year, we appeared to escape, but I fear that this year is going to be more aggressive, not just in terms of death rates and the number of countries that suffer. And we should also remember that there is a large sway of underreported incidents of the pandemic. So it's not just in terms of death rates, but the economic impact will be even harder this year. We already saw it beginning last year. But if you recall, at the start of 2020, the economic picture for the continent looked promising, and there were already important indicators of growth in important centers that we expected it in the major sort of economic powerhouses of the continent, in the emerging countries. But this year, the stress, high inflation, more debt distress, more countries that are already vulnerable going into deeper developmental distress. And a number of those countries that are impacted by this, Heba, happen to be fragile countries, happen to be countries that are already facing some kind of conflict already. So you add the pandemic on top of that, the picture doesn't look very good. I recall the WFP executive director saying at the end of last year that the big concern for him was food insecurity. I mean, we're seeing that in so many centers on the continent. So I think that is what's worrying me tonight, because of how the fallout of that pandemic, economic, begins to hit hard and a number of those already vulnerable countries. And what COVID has exposed is the deep structural inequalities, both within those countries, but also between the continent and its relationships across the other centers of the world. And dare I add, we are watching with bated breath how quickly the vaccine will arrive onto the continent. And I think we're very worried about signs of vaccine nationalism that's already appearing in the conversation. So that's what keeps me up at night. And there are conflicts, specific conflicts, but I'll hold fire on that conversation.
You sleep much worse than Julia, I get the sense.
Yeah. In terms of what's positive, I mean, having said all of that, I want to also pick up on another theme that Julia said, which is around cooperation. And I think that despite all the concerns about the fragility of multilateralism, a number of people were already sort of pinning a death knell to multilateralism. What has held, despite all of this, is multilateralism has held, despite attempts to push against it, despite the attempts by certain countries, certain leaders to sort of operate outside the multilateral structure. There was a defense, for example, of the WHO and what it meant for a number of vulnerable countries. There was a defense, for example, of the Paris Peace Accord, and you see that the immediate return of the US to come into that structure as well. So I would say that in a sense, we've preserved what's important about multilateralism. Can we do better, especially in the area of prevention? I think there are still question marks, but I want to sort of say, in defense of cooperation and multilateralism, that we're still able to cling on to something there.
Tying back to the kind of that idea that, well, I'm going back to your first point, everyone thought, let's just get through 2020 and 2021 will be better. And it's a useful reality check on that. Sudhanshu, your fears and hopes.
Okay. I wish if I was as lucky as Julia is, because I lose sleep, and for many reasons. But one, since I have to talk only about one, this high number of people in need of humanitarian assistance in this year. And if you see the global humanitarian overview, there is a huge jump. And this year's figure is 235.4 million, which is 67.8 million up from the previous year. Of course, this largely because of the pandemic, but also because of increasing disasters. And we have 80 million plus refugees with no hope of solution in near future. 34 countries facing protected crisis for last few years to a few decades without any optimism of restoring normalcy in the countries. And then this COVID-19 has exposed the world to a new kind of vulnerability also. The so-called saviors of the world were found more vulnerable than the people who were traditionally vulnerable to disasters. And now this kind of vulnerability, I think, is going to have a lasting impact over the aid architecture and the way people received assistance or people provide assistance. So I think we are heading towards a very, very uncertain future, and situation is still unfolding. So let's see how it unfolds. However, I also see a silver. I'm coming to the positive now. One more thing that we have repeatedly seen, that we have a well-oiled system to answer to these catastrophic situations, but we have always seen a system failure, and that also worries me. That's why these problems never get solved, rather keeps increasing year after year. But I see a silver lining also out of that. If you see that even your report quotes WFP prediction that there will be a famine or food insecurity of a biblical proportion, that didn't happen. Many countries, many communities demonstrated a remarkable level of resilience, particularly from global south. A new kind of altruism we witnessed before this conventional aid system started flowing down. and that took weeks to months, people were extending help to each other. No, they were offering food and cash and other kind of support. No, many southern countries tried to resolve the problem on their own, and I think the solution lies there. And if it keeps getting strengthened, I think we are heading towards a lasting solution, because whatever protected crisis we see, the system has failed to answer them, resolve them. And if the southern southern communities keep getting stronger, I think that gives me a hope. I stop here.
Sudhanshu, I think you're one of the only people in the world who speaks faster than I do. So there is a request in the chat. You can try to slow down.
Yes.
But indeed, I think, well, actually, I take your negative point as a positive one, which is that this globalization of vulnerability might actually be an opening through which you start to see engagement on a global front on some of these issues that they previously thought weren't their problem. Sherine, I'm going to turn to you next.
There's a lot that keeps me awake at night, unfortunately. It's a very long list. But if I was to think about the one main thing that keeps me awake at night, it's the compound threat of shrinking economies and the deepening of inequalities that we're witnessing to take place around the world. And I'm not just worried about that compound effect on its own. I'm also worried about the knock-on effects on society. We keep on talking about, the lost generations and the lost generation over here in the UK of young people who will not find employment because of the economic downturns resulting from COVID. But what worries me more is the trauma that a lot of communities and populations in conflict-affected contexts are going through, and that they will have to live with for years and decades to come. So again, go back to the UK. If you look at the situation here, 17% of children are living in food insecure households. And for the first time, UNICEF has launched domestic emergency response, and that is in the UK, in the developed world. But in context of humanitarian crises, of conflict and various forms of violence, I worry that the situation is far worse. And I'm also very cautious about overstating that, the Africa and southern states have escaped the worst of the COVID, the implications of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And on a personal level, I lost 2 members of my family in Egypt to COVID-19 within the span of a week, and that was only last month. So what I'm witnessing within my closer circles is that no, the pandemic is having implications and it is expanding, but there's a problem with the level of information and data that we have. And also there's a temporal dimension to it. It hit the West much more violently than and much more quickly than it has in other parts of the world. So just take that into account. And then predictions of poverty are also quite alarming. I mean, if you look at the predictions for the Middle East and North Africa, with 45 million people in the region likely to be pushed into poverty because of the pandemic, and recent protests taking place in Lebanon because of lockdown measures. I mean, all of that just makes me worry too much about the shrinking of economies around the world and the deepening inequalities that are resulting from it. Again, the MENA region is a stark example, because as 45 million people risk falling into poverty, we have 21 billionaires, all of them men, need I say, have seen their wealth increase by $10 billion since the start of the pandemic. And so the inequalities are quite jarring. And they're not affecting people, we talk about the globalization of vulnerabilities. They're not globalized in the same way. They're not, COVID-19 has not been racially blind, has not been color blind, has not been socioeconomically blind. So taking all of that into account, again, I go back to my first point, there's a lot that keeps me awake at night, and I worry about 2021 and that we haven't seen the worst of COVID-19 yet. However, on a positive note, and because I try to always be cautiously optimistic, I think there's a return to multilateralism that is positive. towards the end of 2020, there was still a lack of trust and faith in multilateral organizations. And I've written about that, and there's bulk of academic literature about that loss of faith in multilateralism and the international system. But I think that call for global solidarity has actually resulted in a return of sorts. The question is, how is that return going to be meaningful? What kind of instruments and changes are going to evolve out of it? And for me, as a social historian, I wonder how we're going to be remembered. A decade from now, our children, how are they going to remember this period of time? Are they going to remember it as a period of the golden age of global solidarity, if you will? Or are they going to remember the vaccine nationalism that we're still grappling with? So that I see as the one positive development. And I really hope that there is a way forward to make that global solidarity an actual reality that trickles down to affected populations around the world.
You kind of, and you went positive and then you went back negative. So you're kind of like me. But I just do want to say I'm sorry for your loss and for the difficulty your family, as many others, must be going through right now. Eilidh, take us home on this.
Well, I think to round out the extremely relevant conversation, I think all of the panelists have mentioned around inequality as being just a central part of what COVID-19 hasn't raised, but it has intensified, and it's certainly revealed in a lot of spaces and to a lot more people. There's one more dimension of inequality that I think we can't continue without reflecting on, which is the gender dimension. The way in which the pandemic has both affected not only in terms of health, as carers are more likely to be female, particularly those who are entering households, they're at greater risk, but also the economic fallout, as we know, is also more likely to be affecting women in the kind of roles and the jobs that they have. So I think we can't go on without mentioning that as one particular dimension, which I think is going to be of increasing concern over the coming years. I think the question of what keeps me up at night, Heba, I think you said it so well when you said, in 2020, a lot of people were just thinking, let's just get through 2020. And it now looks like we're all going to be saying, let's just get through 2021. But the fact of the matter is that the problems which COVID is exacerbating are long-term problems which we knew pre-existed the pandemic. And the more years we spend continually just getting through this emergency, just trying to treat the Band-Aid, are the more and more years that this intensifies and affects the lives of people the world over. So I think what keeps me up at night is really this notion that the pandemic is pushing further and further on some of the structural changes, the real investments that need to be made. And obviously there are immediate and very urgent needs that have to be addressed now. But there's nothing about this pandemic which wouldn't have been easier or improved if we hadn't already been making investments into tackling some of these underlying structures, which ultimately are the cause of vulnerability, inequality being just a central one, which I think humanitarians, if we don't make it the core of our business, then we will struggle to meet any of the goals that we say we want to achieve. So I think that side of it is really what stresses me out, the idea that we're going to spend another few years just trying to plug holes, opposed to really thinking about how we can try and be strategic in making those investments. In terms of the positive side, I think some of the others have also touched on this, but I think what's being felt, though I completely agree with Sherine's point that the notion of globalized vulnerability, it's not shared equally. But I think one of the things that people are starting to think about more and more are the interconnectedness of the planetary systems and the way in which that has an impact that can far exceed what we originally think of as sort of being in our safe bubble. And I think a big part of that is really, will hopefully potentially spur a change in some consciousness and might inspire different approaches to decision making, which would put at least more of the collective at the forefront, even though I think that's likely to still be quite self-interested, in the sense that nations and governments will potentially invest in that space because they see the risk for their country opposed to necessarily for all of humanity. The reality is that if decisions are made that way, we still might see advancements for all of humanity in that frame. So that's the potential hope, I think.
A whole rich depth of stuff there for us to unpack. Before we do that, I want to turn to the list that we put out every year of 10 crises to watch. And I should be clear that the goal of that list is not to exhaustively cover every crisis out there. That would be impossible and endless. Our goal is to try to put on the radar either new crises that we see emerging, crises we feel aren't getting enough attention, or crises that might evolve or worsen in the year ahead. So it is subjective, it's necessarily subjective, and it is one slice of the picture, but our best effort at saying, here are some things that demand our attention. It also helps us shape our own coverage over the course of the year at the New Humanitarian. So for those who haven't read it yet, shame on you, just kidding, but you will need it for this next question that we're gonna ask you, which is turning to the audience, because we always have a struggle when we put on these events of who are the experts, and we're very conscious that many of you in the audience are equally knowledgeable about these issues, and we do want to be democratizing who sets the agenda on some of these questions. So when I put questions to the audience, it's not a tokenistic thing. It is really to help us focus energy and attention and get a sense among such a knowledgeable audience of where the consensus lies. So we're going to throw out a poll in which we ask you, of the 10 crises on our list, and we're conscious they're not the only crises out there, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from you about what's missing. Which one, if you had to pick one, do you see as the top priority? And that forces you to silo in a way that's sometimes not very constructive, because as everyone has pointed out, these are interconnected. But as I say, I think there is value in kind of focusing the mind. So if you can, tell us where you see the aspect in which policymakers should be spending most of their attention. And as you do that, I'm going to start unpacking some of what we've already started to hear from our speakers. And I want to start with you, Eilidh, because many of the elements on our list are, in one way or another, connected to COVID, in whether it's the kind of food security fallout, or the impact on funding, the impact on women, as you mentioned, access to healthcare. So you immediately see that interconnected systems approach playing itself out. And you guys at IARAN are doing some analysis around not what a post-COVID world would look like, but a world in which COVID continues to shape these systems, what you call a plus-COVID world, what that looks like at a systems level, what the impact is going to be moving forward. So could you walk us through your research on that front? And I'll just weave in a question that we actually received in advance from Shazeb Khan, saying that the pandemic is the worst global crisis since World War II on one hand, but it is taking place alongside extraordinary social, political, and climate-related upheavals. And so what happens when those start to intersect?
Well, I think that is an excellent introduction to our next study, that question, because in fact, those are indeed the two different dimensions of uncertainty that we are exploring in a set of scenarios, which will be released in the coming months. But I think what's critical for us to look at this stage is really, COVID-19 itself is a huge and is a significant global crisis, not least because of the health toll that it is taking on populations, but the knock-on effects of it are huge. And I think in many cases, what we're seeing is that, as usual, it's the places that are hardest hit are places where there isn't just one crisis. They are the places where we see crises layering on top of each other. And what we see within this frame, we call them ecosystemic crises, where we see an environmental layered with a political, layered with the sort of economic situation, which is worsening due to COVID. And that kind of spiraling vulnerability is so difficult to break out of, particularly, as I said, with some of this short-term thinking, where we are sort of addressing the needs as they come up without trying to tackle what's causing them in the first place. So I think what we see in sort of the plus-COVID world is that we are living in the same world we were 18 months ago. However, we have this added layer of complexity, which is making it more difficult to operate in a number of different ways, but it's also drawing attention and resources away from some of the pre-existing crises and some of the underlying dynamics which really desperately needed attention. And those we are seeing worsening, which I think is what's well represented in the New Humanitarians list. You know, many things on that list are not new. It's not a surprise. It shouldn't be that countries such as the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Venezuela are making repeated appearances on these lists. Because we often have these situations where fragility is being further and further concentrated. And I think, as Comfort pointed out, you know, we're likely to see the pandemic intensify that trend. And that's part of what we're trying to consider, is to think through how the dynamics of this pandemic, both in terms of how they affect governance, but also the different dynamics that they are creating on a social and economic level, how the knock-on effect of that is really playing into some of the existing trends that we witnessed before the pandemic started and intensifying those and making it worse. And food insecurity is a great example of where we can see that playing out. The main drivers of food insecurity haven't changed dramatically in the last 12 months. They are still linked mostly to conflict, to levels of political instability, to declining household income and household wealth and assets. But we see that worsening, or I think we will be seeing that worsening over the coming year to several years. And as a result, that sort of pinch, that increasing tension is really something where we can see people start to really experience more and more food insecurity. As Sherine pointed out, it's all over the world, but most intensely in countries who are also experiencing climactic shocks, increasing political instability, and these sort of key and underlying dimensions. Again, it's not new, it's just that with the pandemic, these are being exacerbated and our capacity to respond to them is being reduced. So as those two things happen, it creates an extremely concerning situation.
And maybe just as a quick follow, Sudhanshu mentioned at the beginning David Beasley's proclamations of a famine of biblical proportions. Our reporting found that those claims were overstated. What's your forecast telling you about whether that is a likely outcome?
I mean, I think it depends on several different components which we're monitoring and tracking, not least the level of the economic contraction. Usually when we see a global contraction, there's a bit of a time lag for that to sort of ripple through the economy to really be affecting the communities who ultimately are most likely to become food insecure as a result of that. But similarly, the sort of the waves, the potential political instability, which we are seeing spreading across some countries, that I think is likely to determine quite significantly the extent to which food insecurity might either worsen or potentially stabilize. I think the original sort of thinking at the start of the outbreak was much more around how much global supply chains and things like that might be disrupted. Those I think fears were originally overblown. We have seen, you know, crops continue to be produced, and we didn't see as significant a price spike in staple crops as I think people potentially thought we might. That's not to say that that wouldn't happen in the coming years, depending on how some of these other dynamics play out. But I think really the stronger pull at the moment is more from disruption to local supply chains and in local areas, but also, as I said, from the consumer side of declining levels of income, which then significantly affect families and households' ability to purchase food, and therefore make them much more sensitive to price shocks when they occur for whatever reason that might be causing it.
Julia, maybe we can turn to you now. Kind of Eilidh laid out this systems level drivers and risks on the ground in the more than 45 countries that ActionAid is working in. what are you seeing in terms of how that's actually playing out, and what those knock-on effects of the pandemic are likely to look like in the year to come for the communities that you serve?
So I think one thing that comes to mind first, and because of the nature of the work and the focus that we have, is the impact on women that's already been mentioned by many. And I was seeing in the chat that some people were sharing stats, including of Italy, of how high the unemployment rate has been on women in particular, losing jobs, et cetera. This is across the board, right? I'm in Canada right now, and we're talking about having lost 3 decades of progress on women's rights issues, including economic labor gains in the first 3 months of the pandemic. I mean, it's quite shocking and stark. So this is happening everywhere, and in the communities that we work in, we're seeing that impact very directly. It's at the level of the increase in the burden on women, which was already there. Unpaid domestic work has just shot through the roof for obvious reasons: people getting unwell, people staying home, children not going to school. Girls missing out on education. We've done surveys and gotten, really confirmed our doubts and our fears, that our fears, not doubts, that girls are the ones that are not going back to schools when schools are reopening. And, there's early marriage involved, the added workload in the household, all kinds of reasons related to the impact that COVID is having that is generating that result. Gender-based violence, as expected, we all know that that's a given, that it will go up when there is this kind of humanitarian crisis. It's gone through the roof. And at the same time, as somebody already mentioned, the support, the traditional support for services and accompaniment for survivors of gender-based violence is not there. It's being cut back or closed down. So even legal clinics or access to any services are diminishing. So we have an increased incidence and a diminishing availability of support and resources. So, I mean, those are just some of the indicators that we're seeing, but clearly the impact on women and girls is disproportionate and quite concerning. And that has an impact on families, as we know, and on communities in a very direct way. So that is worrying. And so if we're losing generations of progress, decades of progress in months, how long is it going to take to regain that ground once we're able to get things back on track, if ever. And I along in that line, I wanted to comment on something that I was reflecting on with our previous speaker when she was sharing her analysis, is that I think sometimes we think of COVID as an external shock, some unrelated thing that's happened and that's disturbed everything, and then hopefully we'll deal with it and then things can get back on track. And I'm fascinated by some of the information that's out there. I don't think there's enough showing us the interrelationship, that this is not a coincidence, that the fact that we're not able to respond more robustly to this crisis, this health crisis, this public health crisis, and bring it under wraps, and the knock-on effects it's having because we can't mitigate and control it. It's not a coincidence. This is very related to all these ongoing structural crises that we have, right? So I think it's important for us as humanitarians to see that and acknowledge that link. This is not a random thing that's happening out there. It's happening, and it's having the impact that it's having because of all these other structural issues that we haven't been able to reverse or address. So then how do we do that, right? How do we continue working on the structural issues that will address COVID and other things as well? Because communities are suffering, and it's going to be a long haul to bring things back to some acceptable level.
Just curious on the point on women, because that's an entry, of course, on our list as well. Have we seen the worst of that now? Is it going to get better from here, or is that likely to deteriorate even further?
Well, as was said in the early remarks, I think we were hoping that somehow, vast regions of Africa had avoided the worst of this pandemic, and we know that that's not the case. This year is where we're really seeing, with, of course, the variants that are coming up, that things are going to be rough this year. The second or third wave, depending on what we're talking about. Also, the unreported numbers. I saw some very alarming figures coming out of South Africa last week, where they were showing the rates of natural death, quote unquote, just shooting through the roof, right? So what's going on there? Is it COVID unreported cases? So we're underreporting. Is it other deaths because of COVID, like knock-on effects that people can't access, health services for other things and therefore are dying. So what's going on? But there's clearly the direct impact on people's health and lives of the COVID pandemic are not over. We haven't seen the end of it, I think. And therefore the knock-on effects, especially on women and girls, I would say we haven't tipped yet. And again, these are impacts. We're losing ground at such an accelerated pace that regaining that ground is going to be a long haul. So we're anticipating a lot of need and a lot of work that will have to be done to reestablish some of those rights.
Both in the short term and then also obviously in the long term. Comfort, I want to turn to you because you spoke off the top about the fact that the implications of the pandemic in Africa in the very short term view of that weren't as bad as expected. And yet there have been all other kinds of implications around livelihoods. One of the areas in which there was a fear was that there would be a link between the pandemic and conflict. Did that bear out? And maybe if I can just add to that, well, let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And as you know, as soon as the WHO declared that we had a global pandemic last year, Crisis Group issued sort of 7 trends to keep an eye on. And one of those trends was what would be the impact of COVID on vulnerable populations or crisis-ridden countries. The other one was what would be the impact on mediation. The others was whether sort of groups would seek to exploit the pandemic, especially jihadi groups, or whether countries, regimes that already had an authoritarian bend, those regimes that were already pretty hardline, whether they would seek to exploit the pandemic and sort of further close the political space. And we tried to test out a number of these assumptions that we made because we were concerned about what this meant. I mean, in terms of the impact on vulnerable populations, I mean, the most obvious one, I think, again, was the economic shock and what that meant for those countries. It also, in terms of the humanitarian stress that was already in a number of countries, whether in the Sahel, whether in the Central Africa region, whether in Somalia, there we saw a rise in the numbers, whether in other parts of the Horn of Africa. It was not a surprise to us that the increase in the number of rates of the pandemic in northern Mozambique went sky high, and there was an insurgency there. So we did see in those very fragile zones where you had a weak public health infrastructure that the pandemic was hitting high there, but also it was hitting high in the one country that did have a more resilient health infrastructure, i.e. South Africa. So that was also quite important to notice. And also in places like Nigeria, West Africa, that had managed to deal with the Ebola crisis. So that's one concern. What we didn't see, Heba, was we didn't see an uptick of violence and conflict as a result of the pandemic. Of course, we saw jihadi groups using their usual propaganda tools to say that this is again a sign of the West trying to undermine the continent. This is the result of poor governance in Western countries. This is the result of a failure of governance. But you did not necessarily see a number of these jihadi groups seek to exploit the disorder that accompanied the pandemic as well. What you did see, however, was the impact that it had on international security forces, whether it's in the UN, for example, in Mali or in South Sudan, whether it's the impact on the French forces, for example, in Mali or in the Sahel region as well. Did it have an impact on mediation? You can't negotiate peace on a virtual platform. You can't negotiate peace through Zoom. But it also meant that mediators had to be innovative. It also meant that we needed to rethink how we did conversations, but it did slow down some processes. It meant that we couldn't look harder at how to safeguard important transitions and important fragile processes like South Sudan, where we've been trying to sort of secure that power sharing arrangement. So that was also a challenge. It also, raised a number of question marks about the viability of important transitions like Sudan, which already had a very delicate transition to go through. And on top of that, the country's economy was on life support, and trying to get international attention to deal with the humanitarian crisis there, while the international community was dealing with the fallout of the pandemic, meant that we were concerned about the degree of international attention on all of these vulnerable countries as well. So it's a mixed picture. I think what concerns me, and to re-emphasize the concerns around what we should watch for this year, what concerns us is that the longer the ability to respond to the pandemic, the more you're likely to see stress on those already vulnerable countries. The one area, Heba, that we did pay particular attention to in terms of the impact of the pandemic was when it came to elections, and those countries that may misuse the pandemic to either keep their regimes in power or to close down the political space of opposition. And Burundi was a sort of a test case to see what would happen. And Burundi sent out a warning that international observers, electoral observers, that were going to go into that country, they would need to self-isolate, and the ability to monitor the elections meant that the credibility of those elections would be called into question. We saw what happened in Tanzania. With or without the pandemic, we were already going down the wrong path in Tanzania. So the pandemic exacerbated, I think, the situation in Tanzania. In Ethiopia, the government there, Prime Minister Abiy, was right to call for a delay in the elections because of the pandemic. The confrontation that we're seeing right now between the Tigray region and the government is not because of the pandemic. It's likely that it would have happened regardless of the pandemic. So it's quite a mixed picture in terms of the fallout, the conflict fallout for the pandemic. And then the last thing I would say, and then I'll wrap up, is that in terms of law and order, I think there was concern about how some regimes would misuse the security forces to prevent any kind of protest against the government's own lockdown. And then I think we were concerned in certain countries of how the police were being used and how the military were being used. And a number of lessons, admittedly, had been learned, for example, in West Africa by the countries who were affected by Ebola, to make sure that they did not again misuse their military forces in these fragile situations.
And of course, we saw, and the stats changed over time, but in early days, in some contexts and places, that the number of people killed by police for violating lockdown was higher than the number of people killed by the pandemic.
And that instinct to misuse the military, to always want to use a heavy hand to deal with protests was always a concern, and also to use a very militarized response to sort of monitor the lockdown and to make sure that people complied with the lockdown already in countries that were already suspicious of these institutions. The doubling down of these institutions just then meant there was going to be more and more tensions between states and societies who already had doubts about the pandemic, or had doubts about how their governments were going to use the pandemic against them as well. So.
You mentioned the impact on mediation, and Sherine, I wanted to turn to you. One of the entries on our list was perhaps considered a bit unusual, but the fact that peace deals are increasingly fraying. Comfort, you talked about a number of them in Africa, but there's also Colombia, the Middle East. And Sherine, you've written about how international aid has prioritized the pandemic over peace, particularly in the Middle East. And interestingly, I suppose that the pandemic is a Western priority, not necessarily a priority for people in places like the Middle East, where there are a whole number of other threats that they consider to be more important. So kind of moving forward, what is the impact, to your mind, going to be of the pandemic on the ability to build peace in countries like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, where clearly the humanitarian needs are much more driven by conflict than by the pandemic itself.
I think there's an important temporal dimension that should be taken into consideration here. In 2020, until the end of 2020, the pandemic was not a priority in the Middle East. It was a Western priority. And in fact, priorities for Middle Eastern countries and for the civil society organizations and many of the interlocutors that we've engaged with in a number of studies that we conducted ODI, were mostly socioeconomic, were related to political transitions, political conflicts that were taking place. Those were the priorities. And there was a frustration to a large extent with the sudden shift by Western donors towards funding the COVID response, when actually the need for funding was needed for socioeconomic priorities more than anything else. In terms of 2021 and what would happen, it really depends on how the pandemic plays out within the context of the Middle East. What we've witnessed so far is that it has been weaponized by different political factions. Libya is an example where a number of political groups used the COVID-19 as an excuse in order to expand their control or to discount other groups as groups that would spread the pandemic in Libya, or as a conspiracy by the Muslim Brotherhood and some other groups. So it has been weaponized. And in Yemen, increasingly, we're also witnessing how hospitals and access to assistance is also being weaponized by different parties, primarily the Houthis in the north. And so the fallout and what is going to happen in 2021 it clearly means that there needs to be a much more holistic approach to addressing the pandemic that takes into account the local political economy and the situation of the conflict as it unfolds on the ground, that takes into account socioeconomic realities. Majority, again, of the people we've spoken to say, we're not dying of the pandemic, we're more likely to die of hunger, right? So those are the priorities that they need to be taken into account. And finally, again, going back to a lot of what the speakers have talked about, that what COVID has done is that exacerbated the layering of already existing crises. So in order to address the pandemic, in order to respond to it, it cannot just focus on the pandemic alone. It has to take into account all the underlying crises that had already and vulnerabilities that had already unfolded in different parts of the world, Middle East being one of them. And then finally, one important point which came up in the list, but that needs to have much stronger attention, is the subnational reality and not the national one. For progress to happen and for progress to take place, we need to depart from national priorities and national agendas of engagement and focus a lot more at subnational priorities. Again, Yemen as an example where at the subnational level, different parts are at different developmental stages and have different levels of access to assistance. And so the needs are different, and that needs to be taken into account.
I was struck when you said, what will kill them is not COVID, it's hunger. I think that also plays out very much for instance, countries in the Pacific Islands that are thinking, well, I'm not so fussed about COVID because my entire island is about to disappear as a result of climate change. So I turned to climate change in part also because, as you might expect, and I've now just shared the results of the poll, it was the answer that most of you felt should be the priority compared to the others on our list. Interestingly, Central American migration has, after a few years of being very much in the limelight, is the one that got the least number of responses in terms of where the priorities should lie. And so looking at climate change and Comfort, you had mentioned earlier that if you look at all of the different lists, that even Crisis Group, which is normally focused on conflicts, the one kind of thread among these different conflicts to watch and crises to watch was climate change. Turning to you, Sudhanshu, you live in a country that is obviously badly affected by climate change. In 2020, there were 9 major cyclones in India. We noted in our list that it's not so much the individual storm or crisis or particular impact of climate change anymore that is so much the shock, because countries have gotten better at reducing the casualties from any individual incident, but that it's the fact that one storm is coming after another and making it really impossible for communities to be able to recover from one before the next one hits. How we also noted actually that it was kind of mentioned, the pandemic or the climate action has taken something of a backseat to the pandemic, with international attention really focused elsewhere. How do you see the impacts of climate change playing out in the year ahead?
One thing you very rightly said, that because of this improved, better preparedness, now not many people die, and that's a really very good thing. No? However, we have to see that those who survive, their lives become worse than those who have died, because there is almost complete asset loss. No? And then rebuilding lives so frequently for poor people becomes so difficult, you can imagine. Now, before I get back to this climate issue, let me tell you one thing. I mean, this has been very interesting discussion, conversation so far. And this global pandemic has taught us a few things. And one thing, what we notice is that the impact perhaps was felt more than those by those countries who were so far considered safer. Means approximately 67% disasters occur in global south. So developed countries, largely, by and large, they don't experience disasters. And that's why this pandemic, the kind of uncertainty it brought to most of the people in the developed countries was never experienced before. However, in the developing countries, they live with this uncertainty because most of the land mass is vulnerable to one or other kind of disaster. So there is some kind of predictability and coping mechanism at the community level, and that's why they bounced. Even if you see in the pandemic, many southern countries, including India, means India, if you go outside, it almost looks like a normal condition. It looks that perhaps there's no pandemic. No? At a time when many countries in Europe and America are still under lockdown. No? And it is because of predictability of disaster and living with the uncertainty. This is the advantage of the community with our part of the world. But what climate change is, what climate change is bringing to us is that making this uncertainty also uncertain. What I mean is that there was a traditional coping mechanism with the community. They knew the floods would come, cyclones would come, and they knew how to save themselves. Now this traditional coping mechanism is becoming redundant, irrelevant. Why? Because of the changing pattern, unpredictability in the disaster pattern. You know? For example, as you said, 9 cyclones in 2020, and that too, the cyclone Amphan, one of the that was the most severe cyclone, super cyclone, in the midst of the pandemic. In the preceding year, there were 8 cyclones, and now even these coastal communities, they are not able to cope with this frequent disasters. These are becoming unpredictable for them. So now let me scare my colleagues from the developed countries, because they have very recently experienced, are still experiencing the consequences. What is happening because of this increasing pattern of disaster and unpredictability of disaster? One thing we have to understand is that there is a strong overlap between poverty and vulnerability. So those who are poor, they are compelled to live in the marginal piece of land. And this marginal piece of land is often vulnerable to disaster, and they face most consequences of disaster. So what is happening because of frequent disasters due to climate change, distress migration, and trafficking? These are the associated problems. People are losing land, so they are migrating to urban areas. Trafficking of girls and children is going up. Women means if you see traditional, I'm not talking from through gender lens, but conventional communities where women were largely confined to their reproductive role, not the productive role. But now, while retaining the reproductive role, they have to take on the productive role also. So there is more burden over women. Girl children often have to drop out. These are the consequences of high frequency of disaster due to climate change, landlessness, and negative coping capacity of the means. For example, in coastal areas, if mangrove cover often prevents, but they have to cut this mangrove in order to supply because they don't have renewable energy, access to renewable energy, and asset loss, which they built with great difficulty, sometimes more than once every year. And that is creating vicious cycle of poverty and vulnerability with these people. And every year, number of poor people is increasing. One thing we are noticing now, you must be hearing in the news, now urban, because our pace of distress migration is causing urbanization. And most of our urban areas are not equipped to deal with disasters. And now, during extreme weather events, more rainfall, cities are getting flooded, and these urban people are also not experienced of dealing with disasters. So we are getting new kind of people who are vulnerable to frequent disasters. So let me say what needs to be done. See, this climate-related discussion, I find has been made very sophisticated, very jargon-led. It happens during COPs and almost annual event now, but it is not understood by the communities who are facing the consequences of the disaster, of the climate change. It is not understood by most of the local actors, and because of that, they are not able to adjust their programs to deal with the consequences of climate change. So I think there is a need to demystify and make it understood by the communities and also by local actors. And when that happens, then every humanitarian and development program needs to be seen through the climate prism. Everything what we do should be leading to fixing the climate. And then last point from my side is what I experienced during Cyclone Amphan also. Integration of technology that has not taken place yet. And when there was a pandemic, there was the movement was restricted. That time, all of us were struggling to even assess the humanitarian needs. And if you have not assessed the humanitarian needs, how would you design your programs? No? So ours was one of the organizations which deployed drones to assess some of the needs. And then we can come up with some interventions. But I think this is another area where we need to do a lot more to integrate technology in this program. I stop now.
You've already made a great pivot to how we start to respond to these crises in your point around how local communities can be better tapped into the conversations happening at a policy level, and in how you start to kind of reshape the coping mechanisms that they have, as you said, becoming more difficult because of how unpredictable the impact of climate is. And in fact, most of the questions coming from the audience are linked to policy responses. So I'm going to turn to that in a minute. But before we wrap up the part of the discussion about crises themselves, I promised to hear from you guys and women around what we've missed on our list. So I'm going to encourage you all now to head to menti.com and use the code 6696274 and type in your answer about what you feel should have been or should be considered a crisis of top priority for policymakers that we haven't yet discussed or added to our list, having heard the discussion to date. And while you do that, I'll just share a few inputs we got from readers and from our audience. We had one reader flagging Cameroon, for instance, where a civil war is, as they put it, displacing more than 700,000 people, leading to 60,000 refugees and 2.5 million people in need. We haven't touched so much on the individual crises because we've really tried to take more of a trends global approach, but that's clearly one of concern. We heard from a professor at the Center for Global Health at Trinity College Dublin, who flagged a whole number of critiques about our list. So I'll share a few of them. Climate change, he told us, was not so much, or not only the question of extreme weather events, but really the threat to life and livelihood that wasn't, to his mind, as much featured in the narrative as it should be. He talked about looking beyond vaccinations and immunization. We have an entry that looks at how access to healthcare has been disrupted because of the pandemic, and points to, for instance, air pollution, which kills, many more people than polio and cholera, according to his stats. And he pointed to, we've talked a lot about women and girls, he pointed to the lack of data on men and boys being a major blind spot. We heard from Aniela Helfrich, who pointed out that since many in the West experience living in crisis because of the pandemic, have we at the New Humanitarian considered adding or addressing crises in the West, or changing the way we think about crises to watch on our list? And the answer is yes. We have indeed a whole series called Rethinking Humanitarianism, and we did an event last year called When the West Falls into Crisis, that really looks at what the impact of, as we've discussed, the globalization of vulnerability means on the way we think about humanitarianism. We heard from Tony Bergener at Fondation Hirondel's board, saying, isn't the increasing infodemic, particularly fake news around the pandemic and all the conspiracy theories that we've heard, and their consequences for humanitarian work, also a trend that we need to be watching? And we heard somebody point out that the rejection of the vaccines by people in sub-Saharan Africa is likely to be a crisis in the making, given the myths around an attempt to depopulate Africa by using that vaccine. So just a snippet into some of the other issues that we haven't perhaps touched on, as well as all of the others that are obviously populating this list, and please keep them coming. In the meantime, I'm going to turn to what we do about all this, and what the policy response is likely to look like, could look like, won't look like in the year ahead. So maybe I can come back to you, Sherine, for a start. There are a number of questions around funding, and maybe that's just a first look at what may impact the way the humanitarian sector and others can respond in the year ahead. Evert van Bodegom, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, writes, COVID might have reinforced a trend, at least in the West, of more nationalism in a broad sense, minding what is closer, governments scrambling for the vaccines, downward trends in overseas development aid, assistance, NGOs minding their own survival. Is this a trend? Final Gal asks, what's the best way to advocate with donor governments in 2021 to continue to fund humanitarian crises? Someone else asks how you see the potential for increased private sector financing for humanitarian operations. We of course heard some pretty dire predictions about impacts on aid budgets. From what I've seen, they haven't necessarily come to be just yet. And ECHO, in fact, its humanitarian budget, which is going to be announced shortly, is up 35%. Others like Germany have record levels of humanitarian funding. So help us understand what the funding landscape is going to look like in the face of all of these trends in the year ahead.
Thank you, Heba. It's a big question, and there's a lot to cover under it. And I just wanted to go back to a statement I made earlier when I said that COVID-19 was not a priority for the Middle East in 2020. And what I really meant by that, it was that there were other priorities that superseded it, and they continue to supersede it. And that's also related to the conversation and the question that you've raised right now, which is about donor engagement and what are the predictions for 2021, what could change and what should be changing in 2021. And I think towards the end of 2020, there was a rise in literature and predictions that there will be an increased localization of funds, that because there's been an increased reliance on local actors stepping to the forefront of the COVID response, civil society organizations stepping into the gap where international actors were usually active on the ground, that this would result in a true form of localization. I have written previously about false localization, that within that discourse it has not materialized into a genuine ceding of power and ceding of access and influence to local actors. Now, in terms of what could happen in 2021, what we're witnessing is that while there is an increasing reliance on local actors, that there is still very much the same instruments and the same approach that's been used prior to the pandemic and prior to that new discourse on increased or deepening of localization. And that is actually a worry and a concern, because going forward, what really needs to happen is a rethink of how that global solidarity in response to the pandemic can materialize. And localization of the donor response is a very big part of that puzzle. The other caveat and the other important part of that is the recognition of the importance of understanding local political economies and the do no harm principle, reinvigorating do no harm all over again, and making sure that as international actors are engaging in different parts of the world, that they're armed by an understanding and a good understanding of local political economies and the complexities that are related to that. And we've spoken, all speakers have addressed the layering aspect of various crises, one on top of the other, that have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And which takes me to the second point, which is there is an overemphasis at the moment on conflict sensitivity, on conflict prevention, and bringing that back to the foreground for the aid sector. And while I think this is important, I also recognize that there's a need, an overwhelming call from affected populations for that conflict sensitivity to be a lot more than a tick box exercise, and to be really embedded in a deep understanding of conflict dynamics and the history of those dynamics. Again, I quote Hisham Matar's statement that deep crises have long memories, and we need to remember that, and need to understand that, and communicate it to donors, and hopefully, that should be the underpinning of a new strategy for the aid sector and its engagement in different parts of the world. On increased private sector financing, I think this is it's a complicated and very contentious topic for many people. There are champions of private sector engagement, and I'm one of those champions who think that private sector actors need to be fully engaged. And we're already witnessing, local businesses in many countries around the world, in Yemen, for example, where they're stepping up to the plate and they are performing different roles: humanitarian diplomacy, providing and distributing humanitarian assistance, engaging in development projects. They're really playing a leadership role on the ground. But there has to be also, it has to be tempered, and it has to be balanced with through the engagement of other actors, to make sure that there is no monopoly on a particular space. And so definitely an increased engagement of private sector actors is needed, but how to engage them and on what terms, or what kind of monitoring need to be done, and how they can fit within a more multi-layered, multi-pronged approach for the aid sector going forward. I think those are all questions that they need to be asked, and we need to be wary of. And finally, underpinning all of that is the need for much stronger partnerships. And the thing is, everything that we're calling for and we're discussing today, everything we've discussed so far in this webinar, are things that we've discussed previously multiple times over the years about the aid sector, about humanitarian engagement, the nexus, all of that. And the question for me, and posing it back to also everyone, is how can that materialize? How can we demystify what global solidarity requires? How can we demystify the changes that need to take place within the aid sector and actually make it a reality in 2021 going forward? So I think that is my response to your question, and again, I think it is an iterative approach that needs the thinking and the brains of multiple parties. Thank you.
Julia, you want to come in? And I was actually just going to turn to you, because what you've done, Sherine, is take what began as a financing question and turn it into an actual policy response question. And there are a number of questions in the chat also around, is the humanitarian sector well equipped to respond to these crises, not so much because of funding, but because of how it operates? Julia, I'll put a few of them to you, but first, why don't you jump in with what you wanted to add on there?
Just to add, to what Sherine was saying, I think we need to talk about debt when we talk about aid. So we shouldn't talk about aid without talking about debt. I mean, at the beginning of this crisis, we did some data gathering, and in the countries that we're working in mostly low-income countries and in Africa in particular, some countries were paying from 3 to 5 times more in debt servicing than investing in their public health sector at the beginning of a global pandemic. This doesn't make any sense. So this is something that needs to be addressed, and we shouldn't let our governments and the private sector that hold a lot of that debt off the hook on that front. The other is that we need to talk about taxes and the capacity for governments to do this, assistance that needs to be done and not just rely on the international system. So ending subsidies and getting the private sector to pay their taxes, which they are avoiding, immorally and really outrageously, has to be part of the answer to how we fund the needs that are arising, right? We know it can't just be the humanitarian international sector. And these elements, the debt, aid, tax, triangle that's not working really needs to be emphasized. So I think we have a role as humanitarians to really make sure that conversation is alive and is being pushed forward. So I wanted to just add that to Sherine. But I don't know if you're going to ask me about. I
will, but I'm just going to let Eilidh jump in, and then I'm going to come back to you. But it's interesting that those kinds of conversations are not usually ones that humanitarians feel they should be the ones having, and that's part of the challenge, right? They say that's political, that's about government, that's not, we're staying in our lane. And I think I've found it very interesting to see an evolution in the way humanitarians are now starting to see their advocacy role on some political issues. But Eilidh, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to sort of touch in on the conversation around financing, because I think it links back to the point about localization, whereby so many humanitarian actors are trapped in this path dependency, where it's the way we've always operated, this is the way we do operate, so we have to fundraise for it, and we have to find the money from somewhere. So is it different modalities of raising money, and how do we come up with those funds? But I think we're not asking ourselves the question that has to happen first, of what is each actor's critical role within the system, and how much money do you actually need? Because for many formal and large international humanitarian actors, if we're serious about localization, you probably don't need as much money as you used to flowing through your systems. So rather than jumping from where we are today to how do we fundraise to keep going in delivering work exactly how we are, we need to think more strategically and more creatively about the fact that our commitments to localization offer us the opportunity to work differently and to allocate resources more effectively, which might actually mean that the drop in funding pushes us to pull it to a different location. And it's not that we need less money overall in the system to deliver some of these programs, but I just think before we have the discussion about how do we fundraise, we need to answer the question of who are we fundraising for and how are we effectively getting it to the right people, rather than automatically assuming that continuing to sort of pay for the way we've been doing business is the right way forward. So I just wanted to put that in, because I think it's an absolute pivotal question that we almost always seem to jump. We just assume we need the money and we need to be the ones who get it, whereas really that preliminary question goes unanswered far too often.
And there are a number of comments or have questions in the chat around exactly what is the role of the humanitarian sector in all of this? To what extent should or is the humanitarian sector best placed to deal with these crises on a large and international scale was one of the comments. Another saying, you know, the COVID-related stimulus package is $1.9 trillion in the US. To help a relatively well-functioning, although not so much lately, large country get over COVID. And we're talking about a $30 billion humanitarian sector. To what extent should it be expected to be building for the long term with that small of a budget, relatively speaking? Another comment saying, sounds like the current humanitarian system as we know it, despite all of the incremental efforts, isn't fit to deal with the underlying factors of these ecosystemic crises. And so, you know, how do you, is there an opportunity for a paradigm shift? The question continues. I'm just trying to jump through all of it based on this kind of shift in consciousness at the planetary level. And instead of looking vertically, local community to global level, also looking horizontally at how to harness mutual collaborative efforts. So again, kind of thinking beyond the humanitarian sector towards what else is out there. Julia, how do you think about that? You obviously ActionAid does both humanitarian work and longer-term development efforts. Where do you see the humanitarian sector's role in responding to all of these challenges?
So yeah, great questions that are coming up there, and definitely I think we have a role. I think it could be defined, going back to the financing question. I mean, if it helps, as strictly, you know, there is a humanitarian need here. This can not only be covered by humanitarian response, it has to address the structural causes. Governments need to have more funding. We need to address the debt, tax, et cetera questions, right? I mean, if you want to depoliticize it, though it is a profoundly political issue, I think there is a way for humanitarians to sound the alarm of all that needs to happen to address these humanitarian needs. But I think the change, the game changer is linked to localization. And we would argue at ActionAid that it's linked around more specifically shifting power to women's groups and feminist groups on the ground to respond to emergencies. So we've been investing in creating what we call the ActionAid's humanitarian signature, which focuses on working with women on the ground to address humanitarian crisis, no matter what the nature of the crisis is, to transfer more funds directly to those groups. So our current percentage is 60% of our funding going directly to groups on the ground, of which most of those are women-led and feminist organizations. And then using the humanitarian crisis, thereby using the humanitarian crisis response to shift power and to challenge structures that we know are at the root of how we're unable to respond, or the impact and the knock-on effects that crises have on societies. So using that as an opening to really emerge from a crisis, having strengthened, empowered, shifted the power dynamics in a given context. So it means that we have to focus our approaches. It means that we have to go step by step. We're also very active founding member and very active member of the Feminist Humanitarian Network, where we're exploring, experimenting, holding each other to account on how much we can live up to that transformative change, which isn't easy. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's not easy. Localization is not easy, and taking a feminist and women-led approach like that is not easy. We're convinced that that's what we need to do, and that's where we need to go as a sector, and definitely as an organization. And so we're committed to walk that path, and we encourage others to join us and to challenge each other and to find new ways, right? To find the answers of how to do that better and faster.
Sudhanshu, localization has come up on a number of times in this discussion, as is always the case in these discussions. But we believe, at least, revitalized by the Black Lives Matter movement and a more aggressive, I'd say, conversation around decolonization of aid, not just localization of aid. Mm-hmm. Everyone always says, this is where we need to head. We thought that COVID was going to be the game changer in making that happen. Sudhanshu, from your vantage point, is 2021 really going to materialize something different on that front?
See,
And I'll just,
not...
maybe I'll just add one more thing to throw in there, given we're running out of time. There is a question also around how we can promote self-initiative of people to overcome crises, which has also been a kind of running thread through all this. So will it happen, and how can it happen?
See, localization has not come up only in this discussion, but in all the discussions since the World Humanitarian Summit. Sometimes I wonder if it had impacted even 5% on ground, then things would have definitely changed drastically. See, I'm a local actor. And from the second day of the lockdown announced in India, I was on ground myself, though normally I don't go on ground. But I was on ground myself, distributing food, loading, unloading items, etc., etc. Two things ensured early response after the lockdown: local actors and local funding. While all these traditional aid agencies were still in their bureaucracy, approving project proposals, etc., and not a single colleague of mine from international agencies or their country offices who started receiving awards for their exemplary COVID-19 response 3-4 months after the pandemic were on ground. Some people say that it was perhaps one of the best examples of localization, when local organizations were empowered to do directly work on the ground. And I call it the ugliest phase of localization. Why? Most of this local staff, they don't get rich salaries. Often they don't get salaries also when there is no project proposal. They don't get insurance cover. They often live a life of poverty at par with their beneficiaries. No, almost. They didn't have a choice. And they also had a motivation. So they were on ground without risk cover, etc. So it was not a good case, but an ugly phase of localization, when most of the internationals, they were not allowed, and there was a sort of reluctance also to take that kind of risk, exposing to the to this virus. So, and this is also related with this colonization. I heard the term like shifting the power. Please don't take it offense, but I think, according to me, it reflects some colonial jargons. Why? When I call that I have to shift the power, I assume that I am powerful and I have to give it to someone. No, what gives me this power? No, other than the notional or some colonial hangover. The power is with local organizations, but they are not able to reclaim. For example, I'm in India. I find Indian space. There's a lot of domestic funding available now in India. I'm not able to access it. Why? Because of the country offices of all these international organizations. They like to call themselves Indian organizations, but they are actually not Indian. They started as international, and when they smelled the possibility of funding, they acquired a new garb. And this is happening not only in India, but in all the countries. So this is the localization for many organizations, localizing their office and taking over our fundraising space. And this is new phase of colonization, and this is defeating the localization process also. No, often we challenge the private sector, and rightly so, for income disparity. While we should be doing that, can we start challenging ourselves for the disparity existing in our sector? Rich organizations, means 55 UN agencies and 10 INGOs control maximum funding, and the desire to control funding, decision-making space, coordination mechanism is very hard to give up. And this is one of the biggest barriers. This is the biggest barrier in the process of localization. Is it going to happen? Not naturally, because it's very difficult to give up this desire. Not many organizations will be doing that. So they will keep changing the tactics to retain control over funding, decision-making platforms, coordination. Every year we keep discussing how to make coordination platforms inclusive. We are failing every year. So
I take it you're not very optimistic that this is going to change.
No. I'm optimistic, not because I expect something to change in global north. I'm optimistic because something has to change in global south. There has to be more south-south cooperation, and southern organizations, local organizations will have to understand the situation and start asserting and reclaiming our space. Thank you.
Now, if you've been at our events in the past, you also know that I always run late because I always try to cover more ground than is possible. And we've been trying to cover global trends across the world. So I have two more questions, and then I promise we'll wrap. One is to you, Eilidh, which is, there have been a number of questions in the chat around the nexus. Is this the moment in which the nexus, we've talked about it a little bit. What is the role of international volunteers and how can they be helpful, and everything around mutual aid that we've also touched on. Questions around how to partner with and work with those mutual aid networks better, early warning systems and how they might be part of the answer, whether COVID will catalyze a digital turn of humanitarian assistance. All of that for me kind of falls under the ways in which everyone knows that the sector needs to change to be more effective. You, as IARAN, look at opportunities for transformation during disruptions, and I wonder what your outlook is, if you can be really brief, around whether this disruption is big enough to force those kinds of transformations that we've long talked about but haven't yet seen.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I would say at the moment it's unknown. I couldn't agree more with the previous speaker, with Sudhanshu, when he says that what's going to change the dynamics of the aid sector are what change in the global south. We've been saying it for years, increased connectivity between communities. We see these dynamics changing around us, and what we've been saying to the sort of international formal sector is either you change to get in line with this or you're going to go extinct. This is just the dynamic that we're talking about. It's not as though it is we have the opportunity to transform, and if we don't seize it, then there is an end of the road. I genuinely believe that for the structures that we think about now, because I think they will become more and more outdated. And I think what COVID provides us with is yet another distress, because we've said this many times before, that this is maybe the opportunity that people can seize. It is another chance for us to consider how some of the practices which have been putting in place, some of the work that's being done could be sort of seized upon to really think through how we can restructure ourselves. We've been talking a lot about uncertainty in these times, and the questions around funding, they really do stem from a position of uncertainty, and I fully understand how uncertainty is uncomfortable for organizations. And I think what this opportunity offers us more than ever is to, as organizations, try and embrace how we manage that type of uncertainty. And don't think about it in a short-term way as necessarily how do we find our way through this crisis, though it would help us do that, but also how can we learn to live with that kind of discomfort, and as a result, sort of translate those skills into longer-term transformation. So seize on some of these things. With limited travel, I don't know about everyone else on this call, but I have been flown places for a long haul 10-hour flight for 24 hours to speak for 20 minutes and then flown home again. So the carbon cost is huge. We can embrace the fact that at this point we're not doing that because we can't. So maybe let's not start again. Let's try and think about different, more creative ways we can do these kinds of things. Remote working has shown us the potential for at least subsidiarity and devolving decision making, but can we look at how we take that one step further to really not just decision making within our own structures, but beginning to outsource decision making to the partners on the ground who see it every day and who are in a better position to actually make those strategic decisions on our behalf rather than doing it the other way around. And so I think we are once again being presented with a chance to think these things through. I think what is always the stumbling block is the political will to do so. It's very difficult to dismantle your own house. I really don't want to downplay how hard institutionally that is to do. But I think, as Sudhanshu pointed out, changes are coming. COVID is one of them, but it's by no means the only one, which is sort of supporting this trend. And I think it is for formal humanitarian actors to embrace rather than ignore, or because I think it is at our own peril that we do so. So I think it's really a skills-based conversation. Can we learn how to manage these things and then apply them to working differently in the long term, not just the short term?
And one of the things we try to tackle on our Rethinking Humanitarianism podcast is how do you make that change happen, and what are the mechanisms of change themselves? I cannot help but, who Yeah, you're gonna throw us all off track. Yes,
I'm
go.
the one that speaks the shortest, I think, on your panel. I'm trying to be concise, but I just want to add to what was just said, that there's an advocacy piece to that as well, right? As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of UK regulatory systems. They don't allow this. They don't allow you to empower your partners on the ground. They don't allow you to get your partners to make decisions. So we need to advocate as, global networks, or for those humanitarians that are based in the North, with our governments, to change those restrictions and to understand that the way of the future is for us to devolve power, resources, and decision making. So that's part of also what we need to be doing, not just changing our ways of working, but ensuring that there's a regulatory environment that allows us and actually encourages us or requires us to do that, right?
Thank you. The question I couldn't help but ask before we close was to you, Comfort, and I'm sorry to put it on you because it's one that probably nobody can predict, but there are a number of questions in the chat around vaccines and how that's going to play out, particularly in the developing world. What is your best prediction of how we can expect vaccine rollout to take place?
Well, the one thing I wanted to say, just to go back to the broader point about localization and about empower and ensuring that we empower the South, is that one of the good news story that did come out of the sort of the African continent, for example, last year, was the cooperation that we saw through the Africa CDC by the member states. Very quickly, President Ramaphosa pulled together a public health team. He pulled together an economic commission team. He pulled together a number of key people, and you saw the Africa Union cooperating in a way that we hadn't seen before. Tied to that, on the vaccine question that you asked, Heba, one of the things that he has done was to mobilize a team around him to make sure that the whole focus on vaccine distribution is done evenly across the continent. Now, only a few countries have benefited so far from the vaccine. So we've seen some trickling into Morocco, we've seen some trickling into Guinea, but large swathes of the continent have yet to receive the vaccine. If we do not ensure a quicker pace of getting vaccine onto the continent, then it's very hard to see how you deal with the global pandemic. Any weak link, any continent that's left out, any country that's left out, makes it very difficult to bring an end to the pandemic. So it's very crucial that one of the initiatives that we're seeing, that the Global Alliance around the pandemic, the COVAX initiative, to make sure that those conversations result in making sure that we do evenly ensure that each of the countries get the vaccine quickly. You're already seeing the aggressive return of a second lockdown in South Africa. This is spreading through Southern Africa into other parts of the continent as well. So if you skip a continent, if you skip a region, you are not going to solve the pandemic. I do want to say that, Heba, that the problems that everybody's raised on the panel, one of your colleagues already said that it's not as though we haven't addressed these problems already. At the heart of a lot of these issues is political will, but at the heart of also is our prevention. We've given lip service to prevention so many times, and yet, what we've failed to do is to early warn, early act, and early response, and that remains the weak link. And you'll see it play out in relation to the pandemic. You'll see it play out in relation to the vaccine. You'll see it play out in relation to public health service. You'll see it play out in relation to localization. We've talked successively about all these issues. We've talked successively about how you bring aid further down into localities, how you make sure that it's the communities who know these situations well enough, how you ensure that they are the ones who drive the initiatives. And we talk about this, we talk about opportunities, and yet we seem to repeat the same mistakes. So I hope that there is a genuine conversation that emerges out of the pandemic that really begins to, implement what we mean by localization, implement by what we mean by community-led, community-driven responses. This doesn't necessarily rule out the play and the roles that INGOs can play, because INGOs can be supportive, but it does mean that we genuinely work in partnership with those local instruments, with those community instruments, and with those closest to the crisis, closest to the issues that we are talking about today.
We are going to have to leave it there. There is always more to discuss, but if you do want to dive deeper into these issues, you can sign up to receive our daily or weekly email digest. We do return to a lot of these topics in our coverage on a pretty regular basis. And in particular, these questions around policy response, funding to local actors and so on, it is part and parcel of what we look at in our Rethinking Humanitarianism series and podcast. So subscribe to that as well. I want to thank everyone for sticking through until now. Thank you to the speakers for your insights. Thank you to all of you around the world for your thoughts. We will be parsing through the Mentimeter responses that are still coming in and sending around a wrap-up of the discussion, including the audience's input, and send that around to all those who registered by email. So thank you very much, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.